Okay. Hello. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, in the future I'll have to figure out what the best way to get here is. Um, One in here. Yay. All right. Um, let's have focus again. I'm sorry. I really am this discombobulated, but usually not this much. All right. Oh, that's better. Okay. So this is philosophy 100B, rationalists. And I'm Abe Stone. You can call me Abe, or you can call me Professor Stone. I'm fine either way. Um, and um, we have a TA. His name is James Reed. He's not here tonight though because he's not feeling well, unfortunately. But um, uh, hopefully he'll be back in shape for discussion sections that are going to start next week. Um, And let's see. So today I'm gonna first like go through the syllabus and discuss like course requirements and stuff like that. And then I'm gonna give a short, or maybe not that short, introduction to what the course is about. Um, uh, so let's see. First of all, how to get in touch with me. The best way to get in touch with me is email. Um, and uh, I try to check it at least a couple times a day, so I should be not too hard to reach that way. Um, yeah, I didn't put my office phone number down here. I'm not in my office very much. So I live in Berkeley. So it's a long commute, and I kind of actually before I had kids, I used to like come down here 3 days a week, and I'd be here from like early in the morning till late at night. But then that all changed when my oldest daughter was born, almost exactly 16 years ago. So now I kind of like try to come here for as little time as possible. So yeah, I'm not in my office that much, and therefore my office phone number wouldn't be a good way to reach me. Um, there's a URL in the syllabus. I won't write it up on the board because you all have it, but that takes you to like a page with like a list of all my courses that I've ever taught, but the two courses I'm teaching right now are right at the top. Um, and there you can find a link to the online syllabus and the assignments and um, um, YouTube channel and the Zoom link. And um, so if um, the online syllabus gets updated. So like, I mean, first of all, when I put the recording of this lecture up tomorrow morning, I'll also add a link to it on the syllabus. And so those links will get added. Um, Also, links to the assignments are in the syllabus. And the links to the metaphysics exercises, which I'll discuss in a moment. Well, as they go up, those links will be added to the syllabus. Um, um, so was I've so before I teach a course, if I have recordings from the last time I taught it, I listen to myself, like in the car. And I got in the car with my daughter and turned it on and it started my voice. And I was like, oh, sorry, I turned it off. And I was like, so every time this happens, you get a little bit of education, right? And she said, well, it's mostly. So, anyway, I apologize for that speech habit. Uh, okay, so course. Oh, I guess I should start with this. So I'm going to lecture here in person. I mean, unless for some reason, uh, like the roads are closed or whatever. But there also will be a Zoom feed of every lecture and I'll put the recordings up on YouTube. Now, I mean, and also I should say, attendance at lecture is not a course requirement. I really advise you to come to lecture, but I'm not going to take attendance. Um, I really hope people come to lecture, best if in person, because I don't like talking to like no one. If not in person, then via Zoom. Um, uh, but I know as the quarter drags on to the end, that there's not as many people there, unfortunately, but I encourage you to come. Um, uh, but if you can't, then you can always watch the recording on YouTube. You can't or don't want to or whatever. Um, okay, so the grade or well, just course requirements. So first of all, so like I said, why am I out of focus again? Why is this happening? So attendance at lecture is not a course requirement. Participation in discussion sections is a course requirement. But what that means is, so, I mean, first of all, it's participation, not attendance. So, like, in other words, if you, at the end of the quarter, I'll ask the TA for a list of people who are good participants in section. It doesn't necessarily mean you were there every time, but it means like you were there often and you participated. And then what I do with that list is, um, I look down and if people's grade is near a borderline, and this a fair number of grades are often near a borderline, um, then if you're on that list, I'll raise your grade. So in other words, you could get it, it says the course requirement, you could get an A in the course and never go to participate, never participate in section, but there's an incentive to participate in section. It could raise your grade. Um, Okay, the second thing, I don't know how that QQQ ended up there. All right, anyway, the second thing, metaphysics exercises. So the metaphysics exercises are a kind of, it's like a quiz. I mean, it's not timed or anything, but it's something you take it's like a multiple choice assignment. It will be available through Canvas. Um, and all of those together, I think there will be a total of maybe 10 or 11, I'm not sure. Anyway, all of those together are worth 35% of your grades. So you should definitely do them, right? I mean, each individual question isn't worth that much, but all of them put together is 35% of the grade. Um, However, they will be graded heavily on a curve, meaning like, so they're actually fairly difficult. I've tried to make them easier over the years, but they're still fairly difficult. Like oftentimes, the median person only gets half of them right or something like that. That means that getting half of them right would be like a A minus or B plus. if that happens. So I'm saying that now, and I'll emphasize it again because I always get questions in the middle of the quarter, like Canvas says I'm failing the metaphysics exercises, but Canvas thinks that it's like 50% is a F and 60, whatever. It's not graded that way at all. What happens is I'll add up total number of points that everyone got at the end of the quarter, and then I'll kind of, it's not really a curve, but I'll kind of like, yeah, divide it up naturally into grades in such a way that, yeah, the most common grades will be A minus and B plus. Like no one has ever failed the metaphysics exercises part, except if they just literally didn't do any of them. Then I have, I can't give credit if they didn't do anything, any of them. But people who got like one right all quarter, got like a C or something. So they're hard, but you shouldn't stress out about them too much. Um, and then there's two short papers due January 30th and February 20th. Each is worth 15% of the grade. They're not exactly papers really. They're kind of maybe the term exercises would have been more appropriate for these. By the way, I don't know why I started calling them metaphysics exercises. I could have just called them, I don't know, like take home quizzes or something, but they're called metaphysics exercises. So that's that. So these two short written assignments are also kind of exercises. Like the first one is going to be to take a short passage from Descartes, and I give a selection of passages and explain briefly what Descartes' argument is. Raise an objection to his argument, and then say how Descartes might answer the objection. That's the first assignment. So it's not really a paper. It's not like you have a thesis statement and, whatever. You just like do those three things. And the second one on Spinoza is it's slightly different, but it's a similar type of idea. Just basically like these are type of things that you need that you would need to do if you plan to read philosophy carefully, which I hope you do a little bit, at least. Right. So like that Descartes one is a bit, like um, it's easy when you're reading along in a philosopher to have all these objections come up. But the first thing you have to do if you're trying to read it carefully is try to say, oh, well, what would they say about that? Right. So that's what the exercise is. And then there's one like actual paper, 6 to 8 pages, which is worth 35% of the grade, and that will be due March 17th. That is in finals week. Um, and um, and there's, I mean, except for the metaphysics exercises, these assignments are all already up. You can read them now. You could do them now if you wanted to. So like for the final paper, there's a list of suggested topics. Um, and yeah, I'll talk about it more when we get to it. Um, but a week before it's due, and this is the thing I did because this course fulfills part of your disciplinary communication requirement in philosophy if you're a philosophy major. So it's supposed to be more writing intensive. So, I mean, some people have people hand in a complete draft of their paper in advance. But it seemed to me that like if you have to, I mean, the course is only 10 weeks long. If you have to produce a complete draft of your paper before the end of the course, that means you can't write about anything in like the last third of the course, probably. So as a compromise, what I do is you write an introductory paragraph and an outline. And of course, you don't have to use that introductory paragraph or follow that outline in the eventual paper. In fact, the idea of it is you're supposed to get feedback from it, and then you might write a better paper. So, and the feedback, I used to try to get the TA to do written feedback, but it turned out that that's a really short turnaround, and the written feedback was really brief, and it wasn't that useful. And so I switched to So now the idea is there'll be special sections after the that paragraph and outline are in and before the final paper is due, where you can get feedback from the TA and your fellow students who are there about like, is this a good idea for a paper or whatever. Um, so that preliminary assignment with the introductory paragraph and the outline isn't separately graded. Um, but um, if you don't hand it in at all, and then it says, or if it's wholly unsatisfactory, that's meant to be a very low bar. Like if it's a paragraph and an outline, it's okay. I want to rule out that someone would just hand in a bunch of gibberish, right? So if you don't hand it in at all, or it's wholly unsatisfactory, then your final paper grade will go down one step, right? Like from A to A minus. So therefore, you should definitely do it, right? Because you don't have to do it at all well. It just has to not be wholly unsatisfactory. You just scribble down any paragraph. Well, really, you should try to do a good paragraph so you can get good feedback. But if you don't have time, just scribble down some paragraph, hand it in. All right. Um, Papers are due via Canvas. They're due via Canvas, but the instructions are not on Canvas. But if you go to the assignment on Canvas, there's a link to the instructions. So, you should be okay. Please do not plagiarize. I feel like this is almost not worth saying now because why would you plagiarize when you could just have ChatGPT write the paper? Um, I really don't know what to do about that. Last quarter, I tried having an in-person final, um, which was it was just like questions about the assignments that people themselves had handed in. So it was like, what was the thesis of your paper? Stuff like that. Um, And I talked to the TA about it afterwards, and it seems like we didn't get very good information from that. Like either no one was using ChatGPT or the people who were using it understood what it wrote for them well enough to answer those questions or whatever. So I don't want to go to like a real final exam where you have to sit down and because what a bad way to write about philosophy, right? Like, you know, like it's ticking. You have to. So I don't know. I hope I feel like people are not doing this as much as professors are afraid they're doing it. But I know obviously some people are doing it. I, you know, if we turn up something that I'm like, oh, come on, that was written by ChatGPT, then maybe I would try to like report it or something, and like it'll be just my word against yours. But for the most part, I'm just encouraging you not to do it because, I mean, uh, like remember, you're paying me, I'm not paying you. If you don't write your own paper, it's like if you took a, uh gym course and then like had someone else do the exercises or something. It doesn't make any sense why you're paying for it. Well, okay, I know there might be reasons, but in any case, anything else here? But I do have an AI policy if you want to use it and not be cheating. The AI policy is that uh, first of all, like I use AI all the time. I have nothing against it. And I say like you can use it basically any way that would not constitute cheating if you used a human for the same thing. And you should cite it if it does something for you where you would have to cite a human if they did that. That's the policy. So, like if you ask it, um, like suggest something I should read about this, and it suggests something and you read it, then you don't have to cite it because if you asked your friend, suggest something I should read about this, you wouldn't have to, right. But if it wrote, uh, if it wrote a sentence, then you should you should cite it. Okay. It says here all assignments are due by 11:55 p.m. on the due date. The truth is, I used to just say it's due on this day, and then, but then I had to answer all these questions of people asking, what time is it due? And I was like, I don't know, it's due at midnight. And then they were like, wait, midnight, do you mean the first moment of the next day? Or do you mean, and I was like, okay, 11:55. But the truth is, I'm not sitting there with a stopwatch, like figuring out when will come in. But if you want to know, it's due at 11:55. Um, okay, texts. Um, right, so there's these three books that I ordered for the course, which hopefully you've managed to get access to in some form. Although they're also, if you want, so I mean, a couple things. First of all, like philosophical translations are all really bad. Like philosophy is hard to translate. There's like a pretty low limit to how good it can be. And most of the translations don't get close to that limit. They're usually they're usually bad. I don't particularly think these translations that I ordered are the best ones in the cases where there's more than one. Um, but they're just the ones I've been using for years, and all my notes are key to them and whatever. So if you want to use another translation, that's fine. You might like the reading assignments are all written, I think, in such a way that you wouldn't have to have, right? It doesn't rely on just page numbers. Um, uh, if I mention a page number in class, obviously it would be the page number in the edition I have. But other than that, well, and also you should realize that different translations are really different from each other. Like I said, it's really hard to translate philosophy. So often you compare two translations and you'll be like, wait, what did the original say? Because these don't sound the same at all. Um, yeah. But also on that topic, there are, public domain versions of most of these texts, and there's links to them on the syllabus. So, if you want to just read it on Google Books or whatever, you could do that. There also are, you know what LibriVox is? It's really cool, actually. Um, it's volunteers reading public domain texts, and they have like thousands and thousands. So, um, and the quality varies, depends on who's reading it, but it's often surprisingly good. Um, and I mean, I will be listening to the audio version of the reading as I drive from Berkeley to Santa Cruz before I left. It might not be good for when you're reading something the first time, I guess, but anyway, there's links to that on the syllabus too, for anyone who's interested. Um, Anything else I should have mentioned about that stuff? Um, oh, I guess I was going to say one more thing about the readings in general. Sometimes the reading will be very short. Like the first meditation is like 3 pages. Um, but uh, um, but nevertheless, it's hard and could take a long time to read, at least if you read it properly. So, like reading philosophy is hard. You have to really maintain a concentration. It's almost like reading a math proof or something. And I mean, and I think it happens to everyone. Anyway, it certainly happens to me that at some point I'm reading it and I'm like, wait, I wasn't paying attention to the last sentence. I don't know how I got here. And then you have to go back to the last thing you remember. Um, and I don't know why my camera keeps going out of focus. Is it something about the weird angle it's at? Like dematch control. Should I go back here? No, still not in focus. Oh, now it refocused. Good for you, camera. Okay. Um, um, So yeah, I guess it's just advice like don't look at how long the reading is and say, oh, that will only take 5 minutes to read because it's short. Um, okay, are there questions about any of that stuff? Or maybe I should say one more thing about the reading. So, I mean, so like in different kinds of courses, the reading has different, or the books that are assigned have different functions. Um, like in a math course, if the lectures are good, you don't really have to open the textbook usually. Right? Like it's the same thing. It's a different presentation of the same thing. You can use the lectures instead. So obviously this is really different from that, right? In fact, these lectures are about the reading. So, like, I mean, I'll do my best to for it to make some kind of sense to people who haven't done the reading, but there's only so much I can do because it's about, right? So like the assumption is that you've read it and I'm trying to explain what it means. Um, so that's an encouragement to do the reading, I guess. Um, okay. Now, are there questions about any of that stuff? Due dates or okay, good. Oh, I didn't mention, I haven't set my office hours yet. I'm thinking the office hours, last quarter I did Zoom only office hours. Before that, well, I was on leave last year, but the year before that, I had in-person office hours and no one ever came to them for a whole quarter. I was like, I don't need this. Um, but I mean, and like I said, I'm not on campus that much unless I have to, but if you really want to meet in person, let me know. Also up until when I set the office hours and even after I set my office hours, like if you want to meet at a different time, over Zoom, let me know and I'll try to find a time, if you can't make it. All right. So now, so who are the rationalists? Um, So I'm going to draw a timeline of the entire history of Western philosophy. So and I'm going to make a tick for every 500 years. So this is 500 BC. There actually was no year zero. No. I'm not facing these right. Um, 1, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. All right. So, so this is how the history courses in this department go, and in a lot of departments. So, first of all, you have ancient philosophy, which, although I know John Bowen actually does more than this, but oftentimes ancient philosophy is basically Plato and Aristotle. This is like it's like a secret trapdoor into people. I'm gonna end up like, what's that creature where like Luke Skywalker falls down into, well, anyway. So, by the way, there's this bonus timeline on the last page of the syllabus. If you want to follow that along. So, like Aristotle died in 322 BC, right? So that's like somewhere around here. I put the death dates of philosophers on this timeline rather than the birth dates because there wasn't room for both, and they did more of their work near their death date than near their birth date. So, right. So death of Aristotle. And then we have modern philosophy, which um, well, suppose we say it begins with the publication of Descartes' Meditations. Now, that's like a lot of people say modern philosophy begins with Descartes, which I think is a reasonable thing to say. Other people say it begins with Bacon. Other people say it begins with Machiavelli. But on this scale, it doesn't make that much difference. So Descartes' Meditations were published in 1641. This is modern philosophy. So 3/4 of the history of Western philosophy is in between those dates. Now, I mean, there's something right about this in the sense that in this period in between, for most of us, so actually maybe starting somewhere around here, philosophy was really dominated by Plato and Aristotle. And really mostly by Aristotle. That is, most of the people in here, well, some of these people at the beginning call themselves Platonists. These people call themselves Aristotelians. But it was all a kind of mixture of ideas taken from Plato and Aristotle in different ways. So that lasted a long time. I mean, that still leaves out this period in here. This is kind of like the period people call Hellenistic philosophy, like where there were Epicureans and Stoics and all that stuff. And Aristotle in this period was, people definitely read Aristotle. Aristotle was well known, and Plato for sure. But Plato and Aristotle didn't really dominate thought in this period, right? They were just two schools among many. But starting in this time, I don't know, maybe like around 300. This is the period that's called late antiquity, right? It was still the ancient world. The Western Roman Empire was still going, but it was a long time after classical Athens, right? Just look at how much time this is. So this is a period people call late antiquity, and in that period, the main school was Neoplatonism. That is, we call these people Neoplatonists. They call themselves Platonists. We call them Neoplatonists to register that their interpretation of Plato is a little weird. One way it's weird is that, as I was saying, they really read Plato through Aristotle, right? So they say things, and sometimes they disagree with Aristotle, but they think they're speaking for Plato's side of the argument, but they use Aristotle's terminology to do it. That's kind of like what goes on there. So if you on the timeline, this says death of Plotinus. Plotinus was a little bit before 300, but Plotinus was, at least as far as he supposedly had a teacher named Ammonius Saccas, but we don't really know anything about him. So Plotinus, as far as we know, is the founder of Neoplatonism. And then in the centuries after that, he had a whole succession of followers. And as Neoplatonism went on, they became more and more Aristotelian. That is, the idea started to gain more and more credence that Plato and Aristotle basically agree with each other, that they're just like expressing the same truth in two different ways, right? So these people became less, I mean, they still think of themselves as Platonists, but they become less Platonist as opposed to Aristotelians. Um, okay, and then the ancient world ended. So there's a couple dates here on the timeline that could stand in from that. One is the sack of Rome by the Visigoths. That was in 410. But actually, a lot of philosophy. By the way, I should say in this period, um, most philosophy was written in Greek. In the Roman Empire, there were some people, especially Cicero, Seneca, who wrote philosophy in Latin, but Greek was the main language of philosophy. Um, and there was still philosophy being written in Greek after the sack of Rome. I mean, there was still philosophy being written in Greek until the real end of the Roman Empire, which was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Right? Because the sack of Rome ended the Western Empire, but the Eastern Empire kept going until 1453. Um, and in there's the what we call the Byzantine Empire, right? And the Byzantines wrote philosophy in Greek, and they also read philosophy in Greek, and it's thanks to them that we have any manuscripts of ancient Greek philosophy, right? Because they were the ones who copied it over century after century in Greek. Um, um, but in any case, there was still ancient philosophy. There was still Neoplatonist philosophy being written after that. That's why I also wrote it down a different date here, 529. The Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens. Right? He said, we're not going to have any more of this. Right? So by now, the Roman Empire is Christian, but philosophy is, well, some philosophers themselves are still pagans, but in any case, the whole thing is kind of has this suspicious pagan origin, right? So I think that's why Justinian closed all those philosophical schools. Um, and yeah, at that point, as far as philosophy goes, that was like the beginning of the Dark Ages. I mean, of course, listing any of these dates is oversimplification. I, I think, I mean, everything I'm saying is a big oversimplification. I hope that's clear. Like if you looked at the details, you would see that it's not really that date and whatever. But it could stand in for what happened around that time, which is that ancient culture ended. Um, And there was a period when not very much was going on in philosophy. Um, so in the Western Empire, they pretty quickly, most people stopped being able to read Greek. So they had a little bit of philosophy in Latin. They had Cicero. They had a few translations, ancient translations of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, but it was just like little pieces. And they didn't have any schools or anything like that. They have monasteries. So there were some things that happened in the Latin West, but it wasn't very much. In the Byzantine Empire, uh, eventually philosophy picked up again, but these early centuries were also kind of a dark period in the Byzantine Empire. So really nothing was going on until um, philosophy really got started again in Baghdad. There was a school of Christian peripatetics. Um, Peripatetics means followers of Aristotle. Um, they had some trans so uh, um, some of them knew Greek and or they had or made translations from Greek into Syriac, which is a form of Aramaic. Um, and then pretty quickly translations were made both from Syriac and directly from Greek into Arabic. and people started reading philosophy in Arabic, and they were mostly Aristotelians. I mean, there were some anti-Aristotelians, but they kind of thought of themselves as being against philosophy because they were against Aristotle. Um, so, right, it's marked down on your timeline here. Aristotle translated into Arabic, 8th through 9th centuries, right? So in here is when philosophy starts in Arabic. Um, and uh, there are a number of important medieval philosophers who wrote in Arabic. Now, they weren't, I was going to say Arab philosophers, but they weren't necessarily Arab. So the one that we're going to be reading a little piece of, Avicenna, he was Persian. So Arabic wasn't his native language, but he wrote in Arabic because that was the language of science and philosophy. He did write a few things, but he mostly wrote in Arabic. Um, uh, so another, probably the most famous uh, Arabic philosopher of the Middle Ages was we call Averroes. These are their Latinized names, obviously, right? Avicenna's name, well, Avicenna's Arabic name was Ibn Sina. I don't know what he was called in Persian. And Averroes is Ibn Rushd. Um, but Averroes lived in Spain and a little bit later, so Avicenna died in 1037. Averroes was a little bit later. A little bit earlier than that was a philosopher named Al-Farabi, who's very important. Um, so I think right. There's like Greek, Arabic. Um, so uh, I saw a history of philosophy once that like, and I mean, was supposed to be a history of Western philosophy, like from beginning to end. And sure enough, it started in ancient Greece and whatever. And then when it got to this period, there's like a few, like Saint Anselm of Canterbury, right? Like he was a monastic author who lived during this period. As I said, not much was going on in Latin, but a little bit was, So they like traced it from Saint Augustine, who was a late antique author, to Saint Anselm, and then suddenly got to Thomas Aquinas. And these Arab people weren't listed, and I was like, wait, why aren't they here? And then I realized that there's like an appendix on non-Western philosophy, and they listed it in there because they're not Western. Well, like I don't know who's Western and who isn't. I mean, I know Averroes lived in Spain, so Spain is not east of France or Italy. I don't know. Anyway, but I don't know who's Western and who isn't. But the main current of Western philosophy goes through these people who wrote in Arabic. Um, and if you read the later Latin philosophy, and again, we're gonna, as I'm gonna describe in a second, we're gonna read some little pieces of that. They're constantly, they call Averroes the commentator, right? They call Aristotle the philosopher, and they call Averroes the commentator. And they like, it's not just like every once in a while they mention him or something. It's like constant. It's someone whose opinion has to be taken into account on every issue. And the same for Avicenna. Al-Farabi, unfortunately, apparently wasn't translated into Latin. But Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher who was in some ways a close follower of Al-Farabi, was translated into Latin, and they read that. Um, so that's why the next thing it says on syllabus here, 11th to 13th century, Aristotle translated into Latin. So it was translated into Latin first in Muslim Spain, or actually, I guess in Christian Spain, from Arabic to Latin, right? So like the first complete works of Aristotle they got were translated from Arabic. Then a little bit later, they started to get translations directly from Greek. Helped by the fact that one of the Crusades, I always forget which one it is. One of the Crusades, they were like on their way to conquer the Holy Land, and they got to Constantinople, and they were like, hey, this place looks pretty nice. Why don't we conquer this instead? And so they conquered Constantinople, and there was like 40 years when, no, more, 1204 to 1261, Latin rule in Constantinople, right? Like the Westerners took over. And during that time, they got access to the Greek manuscripts there and translated them to Latin. It wasn't all because of that, but eventually the Byzantine Empire like regrouped in Asia Minor and reconquered Constantinople. Right, so Latin. Now, you just see here, like the most important Latin philosopher of the Middle Ages was Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274. So that's like somewhere in here. So notice, first of all, Thomas Aquinas is much closer to us than it is to Aristotle. Much closer. Right. But it's true, he is an Aristotelian, and I'm going to talk more about what that means. But we'll see that our authors, I mean, Leibniz is the one who actually cites Thomas Aquinas sometimes. But we'll see that the other two philosophers we're talking about definitely were also reading him, and other medieval philosophy. And this is also as an oversimplification. Why? Well, just as Greek philosophy continued in the Byzantine Empire, people kept writing philosophy in Arabic too, after it was translated into Latin. To some extent, I think, especially in Iran, that like tradition still continues, or I guess maybe I should say in Shiite countries in general, of like reading Aristotle in Arabic and writing new commentaries on whatever. But it was, this was the time when the Arabic philosophy entered into the tradition that leads up to the people we're going to be. And then Middle Ages ended. Well, then there was like the Renaissance and some other stuff like that I'm going to ignore. I told you this is an oversimplification. And then we got early modern philosophy. So early modern philosophy starts, let's say here, right? Again, this is the publication of Descartes' Meditations, 1641. When does it end? Well, probably ends in 1781. 1781 is the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, right? So like this period is early modern philosophy. This obviously is a use of modern that's right, like it's different from modern art, or it starts much later, right? It's a use of modern, which this whole period is considered modern from the end of the Renaissance on. And then after that, you have whatever, modern philosophy, postmodern philosophy. Okay, so what changes in this change from medieval philosophy right? So we have late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and then early modern philosophy. What changes in between? Well, like I said, these people are mostly Aristotelian. What does that mean? Well, I mean, um, so you'll often hear something, people especially tend to say this about the Arabic people, because I think there's some racist element to this in that case. But even about the Latin Middle Ages, people will say two things that kind of contradict each other. On the one hand, they'll say there wasn't anything original in it. They were all just parroting Aristotle. And on the other hand, they'll say, um, their interpretation of Aristotle was so weird that has nothing to do with Aristotle. Right? Obviously, those two things, like I said, contradict each other. Right? And I mean, the truth, they're both true in a way, but really it's more like they're both false in a way. So what it meant to be an Aristotelian was that you mostly think Aristotle is right about most things. And what it meant to be a Platonist before that was you mostly think Plato is right about most things. Um, I mean, it doesn't mean you can never disagree with Aristotle about anything. But certainly, if you say Aristotle is wrong, you better have a really good explanation for what mistake he made, right? Like Aristotle wouldn't make a stupid mistake. So you have to explain why, in this case, even though Aristotle is so smart, he made a mistake. But for the most part, you say Aristotle was right. So then you would think, oh, so all these people agree with each other, right? Because they all agree that Aristotle is right. But no, they all disagree with each other about almost everything because they disagree about what Aristotle means, right? So when you're an Aristotelian, um, you accept the authority of Aristotle. You treat Aristotle as an authoritative text. And what that means is that you somehow mix together the question of what does this text mean and what's the right answer to this question, right? Like those two have to get answered. And again, with some exceptions, but mostly those two things have to get answered together. So if you're arguing with someone else about, like what angels are or whatever, you're going to both be arguing about what angels are and about what Aristotle means when he says whatever. Um, it's kind of like, I mean, I like to compare it to the way the Supreme Court uses the Constitution. Like the question is, what should the law be? And the answer has to be a good answer to the question, what should the law be? But it also has to be a good interpretation of the Constitution, whatever you think that means. But even if you're a quote unquote originalist, what it doesn't mean and what it can't mean is like studying the Constitution as a historical scholar would. And it can't mean that because, for example, the Constitution can't contradict itself, right? Like that's no good to the Supreme Court. Right? And it's the same thing like the way these people read Aristotle. If there's contemporary interpreters of Aristotle, like if you ask John Bowen what Aristotle means, he will tell you that I think, I haven't talked about this in particular, but he will tell you that the categories was an early work and that Aristotle thought one thing when he wrote that. And if John Bowen wouldn't say that, someone else will tell you this. And then later, when he wrote the physics, he changed his mind about that. And that's why they seem to contradict each other, because they do, right? But these people can't say that. They have to explain how these two things go together. Similarly, like I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that the reason it's so hard to interpret the Second Amendment is that different people at the Constitutional Convention wanted it to mean different things. So they adopted a compromise language, which both sides, or maybe there was more than two sides, but both sides hoped it would be interpreted their way. So it's like deliberately ambiguous. So like I said, I don't know if that's true or not, but assuming if something like that definitely could be true, right? It's written by a committee. So again, the Supreme Court can't say, well, according to one faction, it means this, and according to the other faction, it means that. We need to know what it actually means because we're using it to settle a real question. So it's the same thing here. These people need Aristotle to mean what they think is the right answer to some metaphysical question. And therefore they interpret him sometimes in really strange ways. In fact, like Thomas Aquinas, when he's reading Avicenna, his interpretation is usually very straightforward. When he's reading Aristotle, it's a little weirder. When he's reading St. Augustine, because Augustine was a Platonist, and even though, as I say, Platonists and Aristotelians kind of merge into each other, there's some big differences there. Sometimes he'll say Augustine says this because he's following Plato, but usually he can't say that. Augustine is a saint. And remember, St. Thomas Aquinas is a saint now, but he wasn't a saint then. He was a pretty controversial figure who was involved in this suspicious attempt to introduce this pagan and Muslim tradition of philosophy into the church, right? So he was on thin ice, actually. So he couldn't say that very often. And so he had to say that Augustine somehow meant what he thought the right answer was. And therefore, his interpretations of Augustine are bizarre. Right. So that's the way it works. These people are anti-Aristotelians. That's what changes. So like what primarily changes is, of course, these people have different opinions from each other and from everyone here, but these people also had different opinions from each other, right? But what changes is now they're not trying to attribute the opinions to Aristotle. Again, that's an oversimplification. That's not the only thing that changes at the end of the Middle Ages, right? But yeah, they're not trying to attribute those views to Aristotle anymore. In fact, at least until we get to Leibniz, I think uh, these people agree that Aristotle is wrong. So now things get mixed up in the other direction. Right? Like people will accuse each other of being Aristotelian because we know Aristotle is wrong. Right? So like if you're Berkeley and you want to attack Locke, that would be in 100C, which is the other early modern course, right? If you're Berkeley and you want to attack Locke, a good strategy would be to try to show that Locke is following Aristotle. Right. So so they reject the authority of Aristotle, right? It doesn't mean they think Aristotle is wrong about everything, but yeah, they're no longer trying to interpret it as true. And sometimes, like I said, they think of Aristotelian as automatically bad. Um, so um, um, so this does mean that they end up disagreeing with Aristotelians about a lot of things, obviously. But it also kind of paradoxically means that they end up agreeing with Aristotelians about a lot of things. Because to argue against Aristotle, so this is true in general in the history of philosophy. Like if A wants to define their philosophy in opposition to B, in order to do that, they have to adopt a lot of B's concepts and terminology. And so they end up agreeing with B about a lot of stuff. And that's very much the case here, especially with the rationalists, which is why I begin 100B with this lecture and don't say as much of it at the beginning of 100C. Especially the rationalists, it's hard to understand what they're talking about without knowing the origin of the terminology and concepts in the earlier tradition. So, so as a, I mean, it would be great if we could have like 100D, 100E, 100F, 100G. But of course, that can't be done. Instead of that, at the first three readings that are on Canvas are like the first two are basically all Aristotle, like little pieces of Aristotle. And then it's just one lecture that will be about everything that happened in between. We'll read a little bit of Plotinus, a little bit of his student Porphyry, a little bit of Avicenna, a little bit of Thomas Aquinas. Um, and, just like on the one hand, to try to give you some feeling of what this was like what Aristotelian philosophy was like. But on the other hand, also to introduce some of those key concepts we need to understand what these later people are arguing about. So what are these later people arguing about? Um, so can I erase this? I mean, yeah, you have a bonus timeline anyway on your, so, all right. Um, so nowadays we usually break early modern philosophy. I guess nowadays and around here anyway, we usually break it into two schools. Um, there's the British empiricists. So this is 100C, and there's the continental rationalists. This is 100B. Why do we split it up that way? What's going on here? Well, by the way, I think when I say we split it up this way, I mean, I'm going to explain where that comes from. It doesn't come from what people at this time said about themselves. I mean, I think it's actually I think it's actually a useful classification, although it leaves out some important people. Like Hobbes and Newton, but it's I think it's actually a useful classification, but it's not probably how they would have classified themselves. I mean, for one thing, British versus continental, I think, if you read people at this time, they mostly split themselves into English, Scottish, French, German, Dutch, right? Not British and continental. That's kind of a way it looks in retrospect. But the empiricist versus rationalist thing is also, I mean, I they definitely were aware, there definitely are different approaches on the two sides, they're definitely aware of it, but that wasn't the only issue going on. So it's a decision to classify people using this issue, and I'm going to try to explain what the issue is and why we use it, how we started using it to classify them. So, um, so first of all, as you can see from this, rationalist is not the opposite of like irrationalist in this context, right? It doesn't mean like people who like reason versus people who don't like reason or something like that. Well, no, because there are like fideists, right? People who think that we shouldn't use reason, we should all depend on faith, right? But that's not what this is about. It's rationalists versus empiricists. And what's the issue there? Well, so according to Aristotle, and therefore according to all Aristotelians, although I don't necessarily understand it the same way, um, human knowledge depends on two different um, faculties or powers of the mind. One is sensation, right? The ability to receive images through our senses. And the other is reason or intellect. right? So according to Aristotle and Aristotelians, you need those two things working together to get human knowledge. And one of the things that early modern philosophers mostly disagree with the Aristotelians is just that. They mostly say, no, you only need one of those. One of those is the foundation of all knowledge. Of course, they have to find some role for the other one. They say, yeah, we use the senses for something, but we don't actually use them to know what the world is really like. Or we use reason for something, but it's just to like organize the material that we got from the senses or something like that, right? It's not its own source of knowledge. So yeah, so they agree that you only need one of them, but they disagree about which one it is. The empiricists think that it's the senses, and the rationalists think it's reason or intellect. And among the ways that, so Kant, there's a number of, first of all, I guess, you've heard of Immanuel Kant, right? Or should I? Okay, right. So, and as I mentioned, Kant is kind of the end of early modern philosophy and the beginning of non-early modern philosophy, whatever. So one thing that Kant often does is to try to bring back pre-modern ideas. Now, I mean, he doesn't bring them back just by like repeating them. On the contrary, it's kind of like what Aristotle does with common sense, right? Like Aristotle, as you may have heard or read, if you've read Aristotle, often tries to defend our common sense, or at least their common sense view, right? Their common sense view might not be the same as our common sense view. Like, for example, when Aristotle talks about women and slaves, he's talking about what he takes to be common sense, but doesn't seem like common sense to us. But anyway, so he defends what he takes to be common sense, but his defense of it isn't common sense, right? His defense of it is this crazy, complicated machinery that comes out with the right answer to agree with common sense. So it's similar with Kant. Kant tries to bring back things like that there are bodies, which both of these schools end up concluding there aren't. There are extended substances. Like, so he tries, but he has a long, complicated explanation of that doesn't, that the earlier, it's some ways based on ancient and medieval people, but it's definitely his own thing. So like among those is that Kant tried to restore the idea that there are two sources of all human knowledge, sensibility and reason or understanding or intellect. Understanding and intellect are basically the same thing because they, in English, French, and German, people used words meaning understanding to translate the Latin word intellectus. Like when Locke talks about the human understanding, when Locke was translated into Latin, they translated understanding as intellectus. All right. So anyway, what was I saying? I don't remember. Oh, right. So Kant says there are two sources of human knowledge: sensibility and understanding, intellect, reason. We can't have any human knowledge without both of them. So then, looking back at his predecessors, he says, as immediate predecessors, he says, and this was their mistake. They tried to do it with only one of them. And then he classifies them based on which one they went with. And Kant was so important and influential on everything that came afterwards that basically we're still organizing our courses that way. So, and it's, as I said, it's I mean, Kant is important and influential for a reason, right? Like his his decision of how to classify it is not bad necessarily, but it is only one way you could have done it. Um, okay, so that's you know that's why basically we have these two courses. And that way of splitting up these people into two groups makes the central issue epistemology, right? This is the Greek word. So actually, this word is not ancient. In fact, this word dates to the 19th century, epistemology, but it's made out of Greek roots. Um, right? And it's got this episteme in it. Episteme is a Greek word that sometimes is translated as, in some contexts, we translate as knowledge, and in other contexts, we translate as science. Um, and epistemology sometimes takes on some of both of those meanings. But basically, so epistemology is a supposed branch, or I mean, now it's an actual branch, specialty in philosophy that's about like what we know, if anything, and how, if we do know anything, how we know it. Right? So this disagreement between the rationalists, between empiricists and rationalists, is a disagreement about epistemology, even though, again, of course, they didn't have that word because it's from the 19th century. But that's what they're disagreeing about in our terms. By the way, you should know something you should know about specialization in philosophy. So, like Aristotle discusses various different types of philosophy or subfields. And sometimes he says, like, the logician should say this or should study this versus the physicist should study that. And, but in fact, throughout the history of Aristotelianism, those were pretty much always the same people, right? Like, logician and the physicist were the same person wearing different hats. There were exceptions. There were people who were only interested in logic and just wrote about that, or whatever. But but uh, philosophy, these specialties didn't really come into existence as like political groupings that um, that people have to belong to one and maybe two of, but that's it, and if people discuss something else, you're like, well, I'm sorry, that's out of my field. That kind of dates from like the 1970s. That is, it wasn't true even within living memory. Now it's very true, but it wasn't true before. It may not be good, but anyway, that's so okay. So epistemology. So this disagreement is about epistemology. Um, um, can you trust your senses? What should you trust instead of your senses? Also, though, in the background, and we'll see this come out, is some questions about, can you trust texts? Can you trust authoritative texts? Right? Doesn't officially belong to either of these schools. But that's the issue that's going on in trying to, how can we use Aristotle? Is it legitimate to use a philosopher this way or not? So we'll see actually the rationalists, although they're all rationalists, disagree about that. But okay, so that's epistemology. Another field that goes along sort of with epistemology to the point where now people sometimes call it M&E. In fact, I think our requirements in the major designate some courses as M&E courses. Not M-N, M-N. Metaphysics and epistemology. So metaphysics, well, actually, there's like millennia of argument about what metaphysics is. But what people mostly take the word to mean now is Well, it's kind of about the most general truths about things, what kinds of things there are, um, also about causes, especially like the first or original causes, if there are any, of things. Um, you know, the highest types of things or the ranking of things also can come into this, different modes of being, right? All that is part of metaphysics. These two are closely related to each other. Why? Well, um, so this one tries to tell us what the world is really like in the most general terms. Um, Obviously, your epistemology had better be able to explain how you could know that. If the world really is like that, how could you know it? On the other hand, of course, if your epistemology says something like human beings know things through their senses, your metaphysics would be better able to explain how senses could exist. Right? Like, um, um, how can one body affect another body in such a way as to yield knowledge? Something like that. Um, so the metaphysics and epistemology should match each other. Um, and sometimes you can start with the epistemology and move on to the metaphysics, right? You say, well, this is the kind of things we can know, and therefore, like this is what the world must be like. Or sometimes you can go the other way around. Um, Descartes definitely, I don't think he's definite, but Descartes definitely seems to is starting with epistemology in order to build up metaphysics. But on the other hand, we'll see Spinoza um, really goes the other way around, starts with metaphysics. Um, okay, so by organizing people this way, we're organizing them according to metaphysics and therefore also according to epistemology. Um, but not all philosophy is metaphysics or epistemology. So, like the big division that Aristotle makes in philosophy is into two parts, theoretical and practical. Now, I mean, these don't mean exactly what we now ordinarily mean by theoretical and practical. These theoretical and practical are, I think the easiest way to understand it is that these are two different kinds of questions you can ask. This is a question where the answer is that something is either true or false. So metaphysics and epistemology are theoretical, right? That is, the questions we ask in here are questions, we're trying to extend our knowledge. We're trying to learn what the, think of yes, no questions, right? We're trying to learn what the answer is to a whole bunch of yes, no questions. Sometimes people call this the metaphysics exam. Right. So, like, is there only material, are there only material substances? Yes or no, right? Then there's a whole list. Practical questions are questions about what you should do. So the answer to the question is not going to be yes or no, true or false. It's going to be like, do that. Um, so the main fields of practical philosophy are ethics and what Aristotle calls politics, right? We might call this political philosophy here, right? That is, I mean, it's not, right? Politics doesn't mean like running for office or something. It means studying this is like studying what individuals should do, and this is studying what societies should do, or what a polis should do. That is a Greek city-state. um, um, So all of these people, I guess I should have written the names of the people here, maybe. And I'm saying people, but of course they're men. Now, I mean, and there's three on each side. There always have to be three. Why? Could it be Hegel's fault? I'm not sure. But yeah, there have to be three on each side. The three on the empiricist side are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And the three on the rationalist side are Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. These um, uh, these people are actually a little bit later than these people, right? So Locke is really after Descartes, and Hume is after Leibniz. So they're set off a little bit. And in some ways, you could see Locke and Spinoza as like different reactions to Descartes. That would involve drawing the chart completely differently. Right. So these people, you can, and I think, these are all people. Why do we have these lists? Well, these are all people Kant spends a lot of time talking about. Then, especially that he spends time talking about in this context, right? Like Rousseau, for example, is not on this list, even though Kant talks about Rousseau too. But Rousseau is, not that he has no opinions about metaphysics and epistemology, but Kant discusses him mostly in the context of ethics and politics, right? So Rousseau's not on the list. Same with Hobbes. Locke gets on both lists, right? Like Locke has his ethical, political side and his metaphysical epistemology side. But the truth is that all of these people, the book by Spinoza that we're going to be reading is called The Ethics. Right? All of these people had something to say about ethics and politics as well. And it's typically somehow closely connected to their metaphysical and epistemological. So this is where it's important that it wasn't true in this period, or even in 1965. It wasn't true that if you were interested in epistemology, that meant you only read epistemology journals and like went to epistemology conferences and you were an epistemologist. No, I mean these people like felt free to write about whatever they wanted to, right? So uh so and how are they related? I mean, they're related a lot of different ways. Like, for example, politics has to decide what sciences can be studied. Right? This is something that Aristotle already discussed with us. And if you think that's like, who cares about that or something? I mean, remember, Socrates was put to death basically for asking the wrong questions. Right? Like this is serious. This is something politics has to decide. The answer that people should be able to study whatever they want to is not obvious. Because when people study whatever they want to, sometimes they study some really bad stuff. Right. So that's there's one way they're related. Another way they're related is what I already mentioned before, the question of authority in philosophy. So the question of authority in philosophy is in some sense a political question about philosophy, right? Like about the internal politics of philosophy. Can Aristotle like be our king, so to speak, our philosopher king? Or is authority out of place here? Um, so one possible position would be, um, when it comes to action in the outside world, but now this is already tricky, right? Because publishing a book is action. Um, but still, we're going to say when it comes to what you do, there's room for authority. Someone else, like Aristotle or the king or the pope or whatever, can tell you, do this, don't do this. Um, Including publish this book, don't publish this book. Teach this theory of the solar system, don't teach this theory of the solar system. But when it comes to, so all of that is practical. But when it comes to your opinions, there's no room for authority. You have to form your opinion yourself. And we'll see that this is basically what Descartes says about it. And we'll see that Leibniz disagrees. um, so, um, so that's just one example, but that's a central example of like how although this way of organizing it just like forces the main focus to be epistemology and metaphysics. I'm not going to leave out these practical questions when they come up. I'm going to try to explain how they fit in. Okay. I think the only thing, so that's the end of my introduction to the course. I just want to mention the reading, say something about the reading for Tuesday. So as I said, the reading for Tuesday is a whole bunch of short passages from Aristotle. It's meant to, um, it's it's getting us on the way to a particular problem that people in the Middle Ages spend a long time trying to solve, and that's going to like bleed over into our people essentially. But and it's not so much for the purpose of studying Aristotle as for the purpose of like Aristotelians knew Aristotle by heart. Maybe not all of it, but certainly the important books they knew by heart. Right. I mean, we don't. I certainly don't. Um, so I'm trying to kind of like supply a synthetic substitute for that by giving you these specific quotes that are going to cause problems for the later authors. Um, and so the texts themselves are set in like larger print, and they're mostly very short. And then there's some like explanation that I wrote that went around them, and including there's some footnotes, right? Footnotes. I know there are footnotes in Hume, and there are no footnotes in Locke, so footnotes must have been invented somewhere in between. So anyway, there's definitely no footnotes in Aristotle, right? So if there's a footnote, that's definitely the editor, or in this case, me. Um, and and I've translated Aristotle pretty literally, um, because when people are arguing about how to interpret Aristotle, you have to get as close as you can to getting the actual words that, I mean, of course, they're arguing about Aristotle in Arabic or Latin sometimes, not Greek, but the medieval translations themselves were extremely literal. Um, like William of Meerbeck, who was one of the main translators of Aristotle and Neoplatonists into Latin. Um, so do I have time to talk about this? No, I'll talk about this next time. But he actually, like, at some point just gave up and introduced a French word into his Latin translation because Latin just didn't have the word he needed, right? Like, they're willing to distort the target language as much as necessary to get a literal translation. So you can argue about what Aristotle means. So I haven't gone quite as far as they do, but you'll see that the translation is kind of weird. It doesn't read smoothly, and it's not meant to because it's like supposed to get as close as it can as giving you a sense of what words are actually there in the Greek. Okay. I will see you on Thursday.